They said she was just a maid. They thought she didn't belong in the world of power and wealth. But what they didn't know was that she was about to shatter their illusions. Before we begin, grab a cup of warm coffee, sit back, and stay until the very end. Because this story is packed with twists and turns that will leave you speechless. And don't forget to hit like, share this video, and subscribe if you love stories of resilience, revenge, and power shifts. Now, let's dive in. The Crystal Heights Hotel, one of the most elite establishments in New York, was where the world's wealthiest men gathered, where billion-dollar deals were made over glasses of aged whiskey and arrogant smirks. Among them was Daniel Whitmore, a ruthless corporate tycoon known for his cutthroat business tactics and, more notably, his utter disdain for women in leadership. To him, women were accessories, meant to be seen, not heard, and certainly not respected in boardrooms. And Madeline Carter? To him, she was nothing. A maid. A background figure in his $200 million penthouse. Invisible. Insignificant. Replaceable. But what Daniel didn't realize was that the woman he looked down on was about to destroy everything he thought he knew. It all started on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday night. Daniel was preparing for an exclusive business dinner with the most powerful investors in New York. It was a crucial meeting. His company was in trouble, and he needed these men to believe he was still in control. But there was one problem. His usual female arm candy had canceled at the last minute. Annoyed, Daniel glanced around his lavish penthouse. His eyes landed on Madeline, who was quietly polishing the glassware in the corner. She had been working for him for nearly 3 years, always silent, obedient, and invisible. Just the way he liked his employees. But tonight, he needed a placeholder. "You, get dressed. You're coming with me tonight," he ordered, not even looking up from his whiskey glass. Madeline turned, stunned. "Excuse me? I don't have time for questions. Just wear something decent and don't talk." His tone was sharp, dismissive, as if she were nothing more than an object he could move at will. Madeline's hands clenched around the cloth she was holding. The air in the room felt heavier, filled with the weight of unspoken resentment. But she said nothing. Not yet, because tonight was going to change everything. This is not just another Cinderella story. This is a battle, a reckoning, a woman's rise from the shadows into the spotlight, where she was never meant to stand. So stay with us, because this story will have you on the edge of your seat. And if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told you're not good enough, drop a comment below saying, "I define my worth." Now, let's see what happens next. The penthouse at Crystal Heights Hotel was a world of its own. Marble floors that shined like glass, chandeliers dripping with wealth, and walls that absorbed the whispers of high-stake deals. For Madeline Carter, however, this place was nothing more than her workplace, a golden cage where she was expected to serve in silence. She had been Daniel Whitmore's housekeeper for nearly 3 years, moving through his world like a shadow. She cleaned, she polished, she folded, and most importantly, she listened. Madeline wasn't just wiping down tables and fluffing pillows. She was absorbing every detail, the numbers, the strategies, the boardroom power plays. Daniel casually tossed around as if they were too complex for anyone outside his circle to understand. And that was the first mistake they all made. Because while they saw a maid, what stood before them was a woman who was learning how to dismantle an empire, brick by brick. Daniel Whitmore was the kind of man who thought power was his birthright. He had built his empire from the ground up, or so he loved to claim. In reality, his success came from ruthless acquisitions, backdoor deals, and an iron grip on the industry. He was respected, feared, but never loved. To him, business was war, and he played it like a seasoned general, cutthroat, unemotional, efficient. He had no time for weakness, no patience for incompetence. and absolutely no belief in female leadership. And Madeline? She was invisible to him, a non-factor, a necessary presence that faded into the background the moment she finished her tasks. To Daniel, she was not a woman with thoughts, ambitions, or intelligence. She was a pair of hands, a uniform, a name on his payroll. One evening, while Madeline dusted the bookshelves in his office, she overheard yet another one of his meetings. A group of men in tailored suits sat in a half-circle, whiskey glasses in hand, laughing over a joke she hadn't heard, but knew was at someone's expense. The conversation shifted to a failing competitor, and one of the men, a cocky, silver-haired investor, asked a question about alternative strategies. Daniel snorted, swirling the whiskey in his glass before leaning back in his chair. Strategy? Please. That company is already dead. What it needs is a controlled execution, not a rescue mission. The men chuckled, nodding in agreement. And then came the moment. The one that made Madeline's blood boil. Besides, Daniel smirked, what do you expect? The company is being run by a woman. Laughter erupted around the room, casual, unbothered. Women don't belong in business. They get too emotional, too sentimental. A CEO needs to be ruthless, decisive. A woman. He took another sip, shaking his head. She should be at home, not in a boardroom. Madeline froze mid-wipe, her hand tightening around the cloth. She had heard sexist remarks before. She had grown up watching men talk over women, make decisions for them, silence them, erase them. But there was something about the absolute certainty in Daniel's voice, the way the men laughed so effortlessly, as if the very idea of a woman in power was the funniest joke in the world, that made something snap inside her. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, a steady drumbeat of rage and realization. She had spent 3 years serving this man, 3 years listening, 3 years learning every inch of his business. And now she knew exactly who he was. A man who believed he was untouchable. A man who saw people like her, women like her, as nothing more than background noise. But what Daniel didn't know was that his empire was crumbling. And the woman he had spent years overlooking, she was about to be the one to set the fire. Later that night, as Madeline cleared the last of the dinner trays, Daniel passed by without so much as a glance. But as he reached the office door, he paused, turned, and in the dim lighting, with an expression so condescending it could make blood curdle, he said, "You know, Madeline, women like you are lucky." She didn't respond. "You get to live in comfort, earn a paycheck, and never have to deal with the real world. You'll never understand what it takes to run a business, to hold power. You'll never know what it feels like to make the hard decisions." He smirked. "And honestly, that's a good thing. Some people just aren't meant to lead." With that, he turned and walked away, utterly oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed. Madeline stood there for a moment, her hands gripping the tray so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then, slowly, she set it down. She had spent years in silence, in the background, in the shadows of men like Daniel Whitmore. But not anymore. Because he had just given her exactly what she needed. Fuel. And soon, he was going to learn that underestimating a woman was the most expensive mistake a man could ever make. Madeline Carter had spent 3 years in Daniel Whitmore's penthouse, moving through his world like a ghost. She was the one who made sure everything ran smoothly, the one who fixed problems before they were noticed, the one who was always there but never seen. Daniel had never spoken to her beyond the necessary commands. He didn't ask for opinions, didn't acknowledge her presence beyond what was required. To him, she was just another fixture in his meticulously crafted life, useful, efficient, but ultimately insignificant. Until tonight. Tonight, he needed her. And that changed everything. Daniel was used to control. His company, his reputation, his life. Each aspect carefully managed to fit the image he had built for himself. This dinner was critical. Investors who held the power to dictate his future were expecting a flawless evening. Every detail mattered, right down to the woman who would sit beside him, an accessory meant to reinforce his image of power and success. His plans had been set, but now they were unraveling. The woman he had arranged to accompany him had canceled. A model, someone forgettable yet visually striking, someone who would smile and nod but never interrupt. He needed someone to fill the empty space. He turned his gaze across the room and saw her, Madeline. She was focused on her task, methodical as always, moving through the space without hesitation. She wasn't someone he would normally consider, but tonight she would do. "You," he said. "Get dressed. You're coming with me tonight." Madeline straightened, caught off guard. "Excuse me." Daniel's tone was clipped, impatient. "I don't have time to explain. I need a woman at my side tonight. You'll do." She stood still, processing his words. I'm not asking." He was already turning away, assuming compliance. "Wear something decent, and don't speak unless spoken to. The less you say, the better." The words settled between them, heavy with dismissal. She had spent years observing men like him, powerful, entitled, convinced that their world was theirs alone. She had listened as they spoke of deals and strategies, of expansion and control, never once considering the people who worked behind the scenes to make their success possible. She had heard the way Daniel talked about women, their worth measured by how well they fit into his plans, how little they disrupted his world. Tonight, he had made a mistake. He assumed she would obey. She wouldn't just go. She would go and prove that she was more than what he had decided she was. Daniel waited outside the restaurant, adjusting his cufflinks, his attention on his watch rather than the approaching car. Madeline stepped out. He barely glanced at her before muttering, "Let's go," and leading the way inside. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere was calculated, a stage set for men who dictated the flow of money and power. The table where Daniel's guests sat was positioned strategically, allowing them a view of the entire room, a silent assertion of status. Daniel greeted them, his tone controlled, his presence commanding. "Gentlemen, always a pleasure." The investors acknowledged him with polite nods before their attention shifted to Madeline. "And who is this?" one of them asked. Daniel didn't hesitate. "This is Madeline. She's accompanying me tonight." No title, no last name. Nothing to indicate she was anything more than a temporary presence, someone there for decoration. The men barely reacted before turning back to their discussion, dismissing her as easily as Daniel had. Madeline sat quietly, listening as they spoke of numbers and projections, of power plays and acquisitions. Then Calloway, the most seasoned of the investors, turned his attention back to her. "Tell me, Madeline," he said, "what's it like sitting at a table like this? Quite different from what you're used to, I imagine." The words were meant to be disarming, delivered with just enough amusement to make it clear that he expected a brief, inconsequential response. Daniel smirked slightly, waiting for her to stumble, to affirm that she was out of her depth. Madeline met Calloway's gaze evenly. "It's fascinating," she said. Calloway raised an eyebrow. "Oh." She nodded. "It's interesting to watch how these conversations unfold. The numbers, the deals, the strategies. But what I find even more fascinating is that no one at this table has mentioned the people behind those numbers. The ones who build the companies. The ones who create the wealth you negotiate over glasses of whiskey." The table fell silent. Calloway studied her, intrigued. The other investors exchanged glances. Daniel's smirk vanished. This was not part of the plan. For the first time that night, all eyes were on her, and she wasn't about to give the moment back. The moment Madeline Carter stepped into the Lexington Club, she understood exactly what this night was meant to be. She was supposed to sit still, smile politely, and blend into the background. She was supposed to be nothing more than an accessory, a silent presence beside Daniel Whitmore. But Madeline had never been one to follow expectations. Tonight, whether they realized it or not, things were about to change. The restaurant was filled with the scent of aged whiskey and quiet confidence. At the center of the room, Daniel's table stood like a stage, occupied by three men whose influence stretched far beyond what most people could comprehend. Calloway, Stern, Mercer. They weren't just investors. They were gatekeepers, the kind of men who dictated who thrived and who fell in the world of power. Now, their attention shifted toward Madeline, not with interest, but with evaluation, as if measuring her worth before deciding whether to acknowledge her at all. Calloway leaned back, resting a hand on his glass. "And who do we have here?" Daniel smirked, shaking his head slightly, as if the question itself was almost too ridiculous to answer. "This is Madeline. She's with me tonight." No introduction, no last name. A simple statement that told them everything they needed to know. She wasn't someone worth discussing. Calloway smiled, his expression amused but indifferent. "Oh? And what is it that you do, miss?" He let the sentence trail, making it clear that her full name didn't matter. Before she could answer, Daniel spoke first. "She's just my housekeeper. Here to keep me company, that's all." The men at the table exchanged glances before laughing, their voices carrying the kind of amusement reserved for something trivial, something harmless. "A housekeeper?" Stern tilted his head slightly. "Interesting choice, Whitmore." "I know," Daniel said, his smirk widening. "But hey, she looks good in a dress, doesn't she?" Laughter followed, low and knowing. Madeline felt the weight of every word settle deep inside her chest. She had expected to be ignored, dismissed. But this was different. This was open humiliation, spoken as though she wasn't even in the room. Daniel had spent years treating her like she was invisible. Tonight, he had made her visible for the sole purpose of mocking her. She could feel the heat rise in her hands, fingers tightening around the edge of her napkin. But she refused to look away. She refused to let them define her. Daniel had already turned back to the conversation, assuming the moment had passed, assuming she would do exactly as expected. Sit still, smile, disappear. But Madeline had spent years listening. She had spent years studying men like Daniel, the way they spoke, the way they moved, the way they controlled every room they walked into. And she had learned something. Power doesn't belong to those who have it. It belongs to those who know how to take it. She relaxed her fingers, steadied her breath, and leaned forward slightly. "It's funny," she said. The laughter faded. Calloway turned back to her, raising an eyebrow. Daniel's smirk faltered. Madeline tilted her head, letting the silence stretch just long enough for them to realize she wasn't afraid. "I've spent years watching men like you," she continued. "The way you talk about money, about power, about people." The men at the table were silent now, waiting. Madeline took a sip of water before setting the glass down carefully. "You sit here, making jokes, laughing at the idea of a woman who isn't just here to look pretty," she said. Her eyes moved to Daniel. "But the irony is, I probably know more about your businesses than half the executives you employ." Calloway leaned back slightly. "Is that so?" "It is," she answered. "Because while you were all too busy talking, I was listening. And when you listen long enough, you start to hear everything, every strategy, every deal, every mistake." Her gaze held steady on Daniel. Every weakness. The atmosphere around the table shifted. Calloway's amusement faded into something more serious. Stern's fingers stopped tapping against the table. Mercer watched her with the kind of focus reserved for something unexpected, something unpredictable. Daniel straightened in his seat, his shoulders tense. "You think because you worked in my penthouse, you understand power." His voice was controlled, but the edge in it was impossible to miss. Madeline didn't flinch. "I think power is about more than sitting at the head of a table." Daniel let out a short, forced laugh. "All right, That's enough. She ignored him, turning her attention back to Calloway. Do you know what the real problem with Whitmore Enterprises is? The investors exchanged glances. Calloway's interest sharpened. Go on. Daniel's jaw tightened. Madeline, don't. Your CEO, she said, runs his company like he's the only one who matters. No delegation, no vision beyond immediate profit, no understanding of the people who actually build his empire. Daniel's hand curled into a fist against the table. That's ridiculous. Is it? She asked. Because if you look at the numbers, if you look at the decisions being made, it's clear that the only reason the company hasn't collapsed is because no one has realized how unstable his leadership is yet. But give it a few months. The cracks are showing. Silence stretched across the table. Then Calloway smiled, slow and deliberate. She's got a point, Whitmore. Stern nodded slightly. She does. Daniel forced a tight smile, but his grip on his glass was too tight, his posture too rigid. She's just speculating, he said. She doesn't know anything about— I know more than you think, Madeline interrupted smoothly. She picked up her napkin, dabbing the corners of her mouth before setting it down neatly. And the best part, she said, standing up. Daniel's eyes flashed with warning. This is just the beginning. Without hesitation, she turned and walked away from the table, leaving behind a room full of powerful men who were no longer laughing, and a man who had just lost control of everything. The night was supposed to belong to Daniel Whitmore. It was his meeting, his opportunity, his stage to impress the most powerful investors in the industry. Madeline Carter was never supposed to speak, but power shifts in unexpected moments. And tonight, everything was about to change. The dinner had settled into its usual rhythm. Low conversations, measured glances, the careful exchange of pleasantries before the real negotiations began. Daniel was in his element, guiding the discussion toward numbers, growth, expansion. He had prepared for this night, for these men, for this exact moment where he could assert himself as the visionary they needed to invest in. Calloway leaned forward, resting a hand against his glass. Your numbers look promising, Whitmore, but we're more concerned about long-term sustainability. What's your strategy for maintaining competitive dominance over the next 5 years? Daniel smiled, leaning back in his chair, confidence radiating from every inch of his posture. Simple. Expansion and aggressive market control. We acquire, we absorb, we eliminate competition before they become a threat. Stern nodded, considering his words. And the workforce? Employee retention has been a major issue in corporate turnover. A company's foundation is only as strong as the people working for it. Daniel barely blinked. That's a temporary problem. People leave, we replace them. As long as the revenue flow is stable, workforce shifts don't matter in the grand scheme of things. The statement landed heavily in the room, unquestioned, accepted as the standard logic of business. And then, against all expectations, a new voice spoke. That's short-term thinking. Silence followed. Every pair of eyes at the table turned toward Madeline, as if only now realizing she existed. Daniel's expression hardened, the muscles in his jaw tightening. But Madeline didn't falter. She met Calloway's gaze directly, steady, unwavering. You're focusing on immediate financial gains, but disregarding the very foundation of what makes a company thrive in the long run. If you want true sustainability, you don't just invest in acquisitions. You invest in people. Stern set his glass down, intrigued. Go on. Madeline kept her posture straight, her voice firm. A company isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. You can replace employees as much as you want, but you can't replace loyalty. You can't replace innovation. When you build a workforce that believes in the company, that's when real longevity happens. Daniel exhaled sharply, forcing a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Madeline, that's enough. She ignored him. Look at the biggest collapses in corporate history, she continued. Companies that skyrocketed, only to fall apart within a decade. Not because they didn't make enough money, but because they lost their foundation. The leaders focused so much on immediate returns that they forgot the people who actually built the company. The weight of her words settled into the room, sinking into the spaces where empty business talk had lived moments before. Calloway nodded slowly. "I've never quite thought of it like that." Daniel's fingers curled against the table, his controlled facade slipping ever so slightly. "She's just speculating. Workforce retention is unpredictable. You can't rely on people's loyalty when money is the bigger motivator." Madeline turned to him, meeting his sharp glare with something even sharper. "Certainty. You don't rely on loyalty," she said. "You earn it." Calloway leaned back, a slow smile forming. "Now, that is an interesting perspective." Daniel's control over the room was slipping through his fingers like sand. Madeline wasn't just speaking. She was taking over. Daniel knew how these men operated. He knew how to dominate a conversation, how to shape their perspectives. But tonight, he wasn't the one shaping the narrative. She was. And it was infuriating. Calloway turned toward her again. "Tell me, Madeline, if you were in charge of Whitmore Enterprises, what would you do differently?" The shift in the room was immediate. Daniel's face paled slightly, his grip on his silverware tightening. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This was interest. Madeline didn't hesitate. "Restructure from the inside out," she said. "Implement leadership that understands the value of internal growth, rather than just external acquisition. Build from within, before expanding outward." Stern rubbed his chin, considering her words. "Not a bad strategy." Daniel finally snapped. "That's enough," he said, his voice low, measured, barely keeping his anger in check. "Madeline doesn't speak for the company." Calloway smirked. Maybe she should. Madeline didn't allow herself to smile, but she felt the victory settle deep within her chest. For the first time, the power in the room wasn't being dictated by Daniel Whitmore. And he knew it. As the dinner wrapped up, the investors exchanged pleasantries, but the energy had shifted. Calloway and Stern shook Daniel's hand, but their words carried a different weight now. "We'll be in touch," Calloway said, glancing at Madeline before adding, "I think we have a lot to discuss." Daniel forced a smile, nodding stiffly, but his silence was deafening. The second they left the restaurant, he grabbed Madeline's arm, his grip just tight enough to make his anger known. "You just made a fool of me in front of the most powerful men in the industry," he hissed. Madeline didn't flinch. "You made a fool of yourself," she replied. "I just told them the truth." He let go of her arm, his expression dark. "You don't know what you've just done." She met his glare with something far more dangerous, calm certainty. "No," she said, "you don't." Daniel turned, storming toward his car, but she didn't follow. She stood there, watching him go, knowing something irreversible had just happened. This wasn't just about a dinner. This wasn't just about an argument. This was the moment she stopped being someone in the background. This was the moment Daniel Whitmore realized she was a threat. And there was no going back. Richard Whitmore prided himself on being in control. His business, his reputation, his image, everything was meticulously crafted, every move calculated. No one ever challenged him. No one ever dared. And yet, tonight, EVELYN Carter had done exactly that. She had walked into a room filled with the most powerful men in the industry and stolen the spotlight. She had spoken when she wasn't supposed to, taken the floor that was meant to be his, and worst of all, they had listened to her. That humiliation burned in his chest as he stormed into the penthouse, his mind a whirlwind of anger and disbelief. EVELYN followed behind him, calm, quiet, composed. That only made him angrier. He turned sharply, his voice cutting through the tension. "What the hell was that?" She closed the door behind her, taking a step forward. But she didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. Richard ran a hand through his hair, pacing furiously. "You sat at my table," he snapped. "You opened your mouth in front of my investors. You actually thought they wanted to hear from you?" Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "They did hear me." His jaw tightened. "You weren't supposed to talk, Evelyn. You were there because I allowed you to be. Do you have any idea what you've done?" She folded her arms, her voice steady. "I said what needed to be said." His laughter was sharp, humorless. "What needed to be said? You don't get to decide that. You don't get to sit at my table and pretend you belong there." She took another step closer. "I didn't pretend, Richard. I did belong." His nostrils flared. "You're a housekeeper." Evelyn didn't blink. "And yet, I knew more about your company's failures than you did." His fists clenched at his sides. "Enough." But she wasn't finished. "You think because Calloway and Stern nodded at you, because they entertained you for a moment, that you're one of us?" He scoffed. "You're nothing, Evelyn. You're no one. Without me, you don't exist in this world." She met his glare without hesitation. "That's where you're wrong." His breath was heavy, his body tense with barely contained rage. "You're fired." Silence. The words hung in the air, thick, suffocating. It was supposed to break her. It was supposed to make her beg. Instead, Evelyn exhaled slowly, shaking her head. Then, to Richard's complete confusion, she smiled. "Thank you." His eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" "You just gave me the greatest opportunity of my life." His expression darkened. "You're insane. You just lost everything." Evelyn stepped closer, tilting her head slightly. "No, Richard. I just got free." His lips curled into a sneer. "You think walking away from me will get you anywhere? You think Calloway and Stern see you as their equal?" She let out a quiet breath, shaking her head. "You've told yourself that for so long, you actually believe it, don't you? You should be begging me to reconsider." She let out a quiet chuckle. "You don't get it, do you?" she said. "I never needed you. I needed this moment. And you just handed it to me." Richard stepped forward, lowering his voice. "You're going to regret this, Evelyn." She reached for the doorknob, pausing just long enough to glance back at him. "No, Richard," she said. "You will." And with that, she walked out. Out of his house. Out of his control. And Richard Whitmore had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Evelyn Carter walked away from Richard Whitmore's penthouse with nothing but the clothes on her back and the fire in her heart. No job, no savings, no safety net. Most people would have crumbled, but not her, because she had something more powerful than money. She had knowledge. She had spent years listening, learning, absorbing every move Richard and his associates made. She had studied their negotiations, their tactics, their weaknesses. She had always known she was more than just a housekeeper. Now, it was time to prove it. Evelyn didn't waste a second. The moment she stepped out of Richard's world, she stepped into her own. She knew exactly who to call. Calloway. The man who had looked at her differently that night at dinner. The man who had seen her potential before Richard even realized he had a threat sitting beside him. She found his number, dialed. It rang once, twice. Then his voice came through. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you." She straightened her shoulders. "I think you and I have unfinished business." A pause. Then, "Come to my office tomorrow at 9 a.m. Let's talk." She hung up, a slow smile forming. This was just the beginning. Calloway's office was a world away from the luxury of Richard's penthouse. It wasn't just about wealth. It was about power. And power was exactly what Evelyn intended to claim. Calloway studied her as she took a seat across from him. "You made quite an impression the other night," he said. She nodded. "And I can do more than just make an impression." A flicker of interest crossed his face. "You're ambitious. I respect that. But ambition without results is just noise. So tell me, Evelyn, What exactly do you want? She didn't hesitate. A chance to prove that I can do more than just talk. Calloway leaned back. You've got guts. I'll give you that. But guts don't get you a seat at the table. Results do. EVELYN met his gaze without flinching. Then, give me the opportunity to deliver them. Another pause. Then, a smirk. All right, let's see what you've got. And just like that, EVELYN Carter was back in the game. The next 6 months were war. EVELYN didn't walk into the business world. She stormed into it. She outworked, outsmarted, and outmaneuvered every person who had ever looked down on her. She learned the ropes faster than anyone expected. She mastered financial reports, corporate strategies, and investment tactics. She stayed late, worked harder, asked the right questions. Every challenge they threw at her, she crushed it. But it wasn't enough just to be good. She had to be better. Better than the men in the room. Better than the people who had Ivy League degrees. Better than Richard Whitmore. Because if she wasn't, they would find a way to push her back down. And she would never go back. 6 months later, EVELYN stood in a boardroom full of executives. Not as an assistant, not as an observer, as the woman who had just saved a multi-million-dollar deal. She had analyzed the numbers, found the weak points, identified the risks, and now she was standing in front of Calloway and his investors, delivering a strategy that would change everything. She finished speaking. The room was silent. Then, Calloway smirked. "Gentlemen," he said, glancing at the others, "I think we all know who just saved us millions today." One of the senior executives leaned back, nodding. "Impressive. Very impressive." Another investor turned to her. "How long did you say you've been with the company?" She smiled. 6 months. Calloway let out a low chuckle. "Imagine what she'll do in a year." Richard Whitmore had spent years building his empire. EVELYN Carter had spent 6 months proving she could do it better. And now, she was unstoppable. EVELYN Carter stepped onto the cold streets of New York, with nothing but her breath steady in her chest and the fire burning behind her eyes. No job, no savings, no security. Most people would panic. Most people would crumble. But EVELYN, she thrived in moments like these. Richard Whitmore thought he had destroyed her. He thought firing her was an act of dominance, that stripping her of her position would put her back in her place. But the truth was, he had set her free. Because EVELYN Carter had never belonged in his penthouse, wiping down his tables, moving like a shadow in his world. She had spent years listening, learning, absorbing. She had watched men like Richard make decisions, build empires, manipulate power, like it was a game they had rigged in their favor. But they had underestimated her. And now, it was her turn. She spent the night in a cheap motel, staring at the ceiling, her mind moving 1,000 miles an hour. Panic tried to creep in, but she shoved it down. She had one advantage: knowledge. And knowledge was more valuable than anything money could buy. She picked up her phone. There was only one person to call: Calloway, the investor who had watched her that night, the man who had seen her when Richard had dismissed her. He was the key to everything. She dialed. It rang once, twice. Then, his voice. "I was wondering when you'd call. I think you and I have unfinished business." There was a pause, then a quiet chuckle. "You're bold. I like that. Be in my office at 9 tomorrow." She exhaled. "I'll be there." She hung up, a slow, determined smile forming. This was the beginning. Walking into Calloway's office felt different. The space was sharp, efficient, filled with people who belonged in boardrooms, not scrubbing floors. For years, she had moved unseen through halls like these. Today, she wasn't invisible. Calloway sat at the head of a long glass table, surrounded by men in suits. He looked up when she entered, gesturing for her to sit. "You made quite an impression the other night," he said. EVELYN folded her hands in her lap. "And I can do more than just make an impression. One of the men sitting beside Calloway scoffed. "You worked for Whitmore, didn't you? Housekeeper, right? What makes you think you belong here?" She didn't flinch. "I spent years cleaning up after powerful men," she said. "I also spent years listening to them, learning from them, understanding how they think. And I know something you don't." She leaned forward slightly. "Your biggest competitors are looking at the wrong numbers. You're all so focused on bottom lines, you're not seeing the bigger picture." Calloway studied her, intrigued. "And what is the bigger picture?" "Loyalty," she said. "Whitmore doesn't understand that. He sees people as disposable, employees, clients, even partners. And that's why his empire is crumbling. Give me a chance, and I'll prove it." The man beside Calloway shook his head. "You're asking for a job based on eavesdropping? That's not how business works." Calloway tapped his fingers on the table. "Actually, I think it's exactly how business works. Evelyn, you have 1 month. Impress me." She nodded. "That's all I need." The next month was war. Evelyn didn't just work, she outworked everyone. She studied, strategized, executed. She showed up early, stayed late, absorbed everything like a sponge. Every challenge they threw at her, she crushed it. The men in the office underestimated her. That was their first mistake. She watched their weaknesses, their blind spots. She saw how they ignored employees who weren't in suits, how they dismissed clients they didn't think mattered. And she used it. She found a flaw in one of their contracts, a clause that would have cost them millions in a year. She presented the solution before anyone else even knew there was a problem. Calloway noticed. He called her into his office. "How did you see this before my senior team did?" She smiled. "Because I know what it's like to be overlooked." He nodded slowly. "Consider your trial period over." Evelyn Carter was no longer just in the game. She was playing to win. 6 months had passed. Evelyn wasn't just surviving. She was thriving. She had climbed higher, faster than anyone expected. And today, she was sitting at a boardroom table, surrounded by men who once dismissed her, about to close the biggest deal of her career. The room was tense. Millions were on the table. Calloway glanced at her. "Evelyn, walk them through it." She nodded, turning to the investors. "We've identified a market gap that Whitmore Enterprises is completely ignoring. If we pivot now, we can take their market share before they even realize what's happening." One of the senior executives raised an eyebrow. "That's a bold move." She met his gaze. "So was underestimating me." A slow silence settled over the room. Then, Calloway smirked. "Gentlemen, I think we all know who just saved us millions today." The deal was signed. Evelyn had officially left Richard Whitmore in the dust. That evening, she stood in her office, staring out at the skyline. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Richard Whitmore. She let it ring twice before answering. "I assume you heard the news," she said. His voice was tight. "Enjoy it while it lasts." She smiled. "Oh, I intend to." She hung up, setting the phone down. Richard Whitmore had spent years building his empire. Evelyn Carter had spent 6 months proving she could do it better. And now, she was just getting started. Richard Whitmore had spent years believing he was untouchable. He built his company from the ground up, dominated the industry, controlled markets, and crushed competition without hesitation. But arrogance is a slow poison. And now, his empire was crumbling. His reckless decisions, his obsession with short-term profits, and his failure to adapt had led Whitmore Enterprises to the brink of collapse. Investors were pulling out. Contracts were dissolving. The media was circling like vultures, waiting for the moment the once mighty CEO would fall. And the final blow? It was coming from the last person he ever expected. Richard sat in the boardroom, his fingers drumming against the polished wood table. He was surrounded by them, the investors he once commanded, now looking at him like a liability instead of a leader. Calloway, Stern, Mercer, All the power players he had once charmed, now watching him with cold calculation. "We've made our decision," Calloway said, his voice smooth, controlled. Richard leaned forward. "So, you're going to approve the capital injection?" Calloway exchanged a glance with Stern. "Yes, but under one condition." Richard exhaled sharply. "Name it." Stern folded his hands. "You step down as CEO." For the first time in years, Richard Whitmore was at a loss for words. His mind raced. "This is ridiculous. I built this company. You think you can just push me out?" Mercer adjusted his tie. "Your leadership is the reason we're in this position. If you stay in power, this company is finished." Richard's pulse pounded in his ears. "So what? You want one of you to take over? A temporary board appointment?" Calloway smirked. "Not exactly." The door opened, and in walked EVELYN Carter. She moved with the same confidence Richard had once wielded like a weapon, except this time, he wasn't the one in control. She took a seat at the head of the table, the chair that used to belong to him. Richard's world tilted. "What the hell is this?" His voice was tight, sharp, but there was something else beneath it. Fear. Calloway's smirk widened. "EVELYN will be stepping in as the new CEO of Whitmore Enterprises." The words hit him like a freight train. EVELYN leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs. "Hello, Richard." His fingers curled into fists beneath the table. "This is a joke." "It's not," Stern said simply. "EVELYN has proven herself in ways you haven't. Under her leadership, Calloway Investments has seen record growth in 6 months. She understands the market, the workforce, and most importantly, she understands what you never did." Richard's breath came unevenly. "You can't do this." EVELYN tilted her head. "I already have." Silence. And then, Calloway dropped the final bombshell. "You can either sign the transition agreement and walk away with what little dignity you have left, or you can fight this, lose everything, and watch the company collapse under your own arrogance." Every eye in the room was on Richard, waiting, watching. He had spent his entire career forcing others into corners. Now, he was the one with no way out. Richard's chest tightened. He had been undefeated, unchallenged, and now he was being replaced by her, EVELYN Carter, the woman he had dismissed, the woman he had mocked, the woman he had thrown away like she was nothing. She had won. His voice dropped, low and venomous. "You think you're ready for this?" EVELYN didn't blink. "I don't think, Richard. I know." His knuckles turned white against the table. "You're making a mistake." She smiled, not out of amusement, but out of something far more dangerous. Certainty. "No, Richard," she said. "I'm fixing yours." Silence stretched across the room. Richard felt his empire slipping from his fingers piece by piece. This was his legacy, his company, and now it belonged to her. His voice was hoarse. "I built this." EVELYN's gaze was steel. "And I'll be the one to rebuild it." Calloway slid the documents across the table. "This is your last move, Richard," he said. "Sign it, or lose everything." Richard stared at the papers. He had no choice. With shaking fingers, he picked up the pen and signed away the throne he had once ruled. The room emptied. Richard was the last to stand. But before he left, he turned to EVELYN one final time. "You'll regret this," he muttered. She met his eyes, unwavering. "No, Richard," she said. "You will." And as he walked out of that boardroom, out of her company, EVELYN Carter leaned back in her chair, exhaled slowly, and smiled. Because this was just the beginning. Richard Whitmore had always believed he was invincible. For years, he had built his company with ruthless precision, eliminating competitors, expanding his empire, and ensuring that no one ever challenged his authority. He made the rules, controlled the board, dictated the future of his employees. But now, As he stood inside the very boardroom that once belonged to him, everything had changed. The seat at the head of the table, the one that symbolized power, was no longer his. EVELYN Carter sat there now, not as an assistant, not as a housekeeper, not as someone beneath him. She was the CEO of Whitmore Enterprises. Richard clenched his fists, his entire body rigid with fury. "You can't do this," he said, his voice sharp. "I built this company from the ground up." EVELYN didn't blink. "No, Richard. You destroyed it. And now, I'm going to save it the way you never could." A tense silence filled the room. Richard had spent years dismissing EVELYN. To him, she was nothing more than a background presence. A woman meant to serve, not lead. Someone who should have stayed in her place. Yet, here she was, sitting in his chair, holding his future in her hands. Richard stepped forward, his anger barely contained. "You think you're qualified to run this company?" EVELYN's expression remained calm, unwavering. "The investors seem to think so. After all, they were the ones who put me here." His jaw tightened. "This company is my legacy." EVELYN leaned forward, her voice unwavering. "Your legacy is a disaster. Investors are pulling out. Clients are losing faith. Employees are ready to walk. Everything you built is on the verge of collapse. And the only reason it hasn't fallen apart completely is because I'm here to fix it." Richard scoffed. "Fix it? You think you can fix a billion-dollar corporation?" She didn't hesitate. "I already have. While you were too busy pretending you were untouchable, I was learning, watching, understanding everything you refused to see. And now, I'm going to run this company the way it should have been run from the start." The room was silent. Richard's fingers curled against the armrest of a chair, his frustration simmering. "You don't belong here." EVELYN exhaled slowly. "Neither do you." He took a slow breath, his pulse pounding in his ears. "I made this company what it is." Her gaze didn't waver. "And I'll make it what it was meant to be." Richard shook his head, his teeth grinding together. "You're making a mistake." EVELYN stood, her confidence unshaken. "No, Richard. I'm fixing yours." A flicker of something passed through his expression. Panic, realization, fear. Because for the first time in his life, Richard Whitmore had no control. And EVELYN Carter had all of it. EVELYN Carter walked out of that boardroom with her head high, her shoulders squared, and her name forever etched into the history of Whitmore Enterprises. She hadn't just won. She had taken back what was hers. For years, Richard Whitmore had ruled with arrogance, believing that wealth and power made him untouchable. He thought he could dictate who mattered and who didn't. He thought he could dismiss EVELYN as just another nobody. But EVELYN had rewritten the rules. She proved that your worth is not defined by anyone else, not by a boss, not by a title, not by the world telling you what you can and cannot be. She had spent years being overlooked, ignored, underestimated. And now, she was the one making the decisions. Now, she was the one calling the shots. Now, she was the one standing at the top, not because someone handed it to her, but because she took it for herself. Richard had begged for another chance. He had tried to talk his way back into power. He had tried to convince her that he was the victim. But EVELYN had moved on. Because some people don't deserve forgiveness. Some people deserve to watch you rise. There comes a moment in every woman's life when she has to make a choice. A choice to stay silent or speak up. A choice to accept less or demand more. A choice to remain in the shadows or step into the light. EVELYN Carter made her choice. She refused to be invisible. She refused to be defined by someone else's limitations. She refused to let anyone decide what she was worth. And because of that choice, she changed everything. Her story isn't just about business. It isn't just about power. It's about freedom. It's about refusing to be trapped in a life someone else created for you. Because here's the truth. The world doesn't want you to know. You don't owe anyone your silence. You don't owe them your obedience. You don't owe them your resignation. The moment you realize this, that's when you become dangerous. Because a woman who knows her worth is unstoppable. Evelyn could have stayed. She could have accepted Richard's insults. She could have swallowed her pride, continued cleaning his floors, and let him believe he was right. But she didn't. Because the moment you accept a cage, you convince yourself it's a home. And Evelyn Carter was never meant to live in a cage. Neither are you. How many times have you told yourself to just deal with it? How many times have you convinced yourself that speaking up isn't worth the trouble? How many times have you let someone tell you what you can and cannot do? You have two choices. You can stay where you are, small, silent, waiting for someone to finally see your worth. Or you can walk away and build the life they never believed you could. Evelyn walked away. She lost everything that day, her job, her security, the roof over her head. But she gained something far more valuable. She gained herself. And that is priceless. When Evelyn returned as the CEO of Whitmore Enterprises, Richard was furious. He didn't respect her before, and he sure as hell didn't respect her now. But that's the thing about men like him. They only see value when they can control it. When Evelyn was silent, she was insignificant. When Evelyn was powerful, she was a problem. And that's exactly what she needed to be. People will tell you that confidence is arrogance. They will tell you that ambition is greed. They will tell you that standing up for yourself makes you difficult. Let them. Because their discomfort means you're doing something right. You were not put on this earth to make others comfortable. You were not born to shrink yourself so others feel big. You are here to take up space. You are here to own your voice. You are here to prove them wrong. And you don't need anyone's permission to do it. Richard spent years believing Evelyn was beneath him. Not because she wasn't capable, not because she wasn't smart, but because he needed to believe she wasn't a threat. Because acknowledging her power meant acknowledging his own weakness. And that's why people will fight so hard to keep you in your place. They will downplay your success. They will question your intelligence. They will make you feel like you don't belong. But here's what they don't understand. Their opinion of you does not define you. Your value is not decided by a man in a suit. It is not decided by a boss who doesn't respect you. It is not decided by a society that tells you to stay in your lane. Your worth is not up for discussion. The moment you start acting like you deserve to be in the room, the world will try to push you out. That's when you push back. And you don't stop pushing. Evelyn could have stayed in her place. She could have let Richard win. She could have let the world tell her she wasn't enough. But she didn't. And neither should you. Because you don't owe anyone your silence. You don't owe anyone your submission. You don't owe anyone a version of yourself that makes them comfortable. The only person who gets to decide your worth is you. So here's my question. What choice will you make? Will you stay in the shadows? Or will you step into your power? If you believe no one defines your value but you, comment, "I own my life." Like this video if you felt every word. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. And if you're ready for more stories of power, justice, and taking control, subscribe now. Because this is just the beginning.